Hey everyone, and welcome to another Kano Reviews, where we review games both new and old on all platforms. If you like the content that I make, then please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a review when it comes out. Today we talk about the game Arkham Horror Mother's Embrace. This small indie game is based on the Arkham Horror Card Game, though it can definitely be more considered as a board game than just a card game, and is set in the horror mythos created by H.P. Lovecraft. I have already reviewed other H.P. Lovecraft inspired titles on the channel, and viewers should know by now that I absolutely adore this mythos that often tells the story of worn out detectives investigating brutal murders only to get wrapped up in the sinister plot of madness themselves. The cool thing about the Arkham Horror board game is that instead of a competitive board game, it's a cooperative one where all the players work together and each take the role of a different character, and each character has unique attributes that can be an advantage or disadvantage. One character has, for example, more HP or mental resistance, or is stronger in combat, or he/she might be weaker in combat but in return is better in finding clues. It's honestly a great board game and very fun because it's cooperative, and since everyone has unique attributes, it really encourages team play and conversation. I really recommend it, especially in these somber times where most of us are spending a lot of time inside with the pandemic, and you can already have a great time with only 2 or 3 players. If the sound of a co-op board game experience is something that seems to your liking. But what about this video game? Well, I was first very surprised, though in a pleasant way, that they decided to adapt this to a video game format since that barrier of entry might be lower and more people could be acquainted with this franchise. Now the notion that it was single player only did worry me a little bit, since of course part of the charm with the card game is that you played with friends, but I thought maybe it could turn out into an interesting single-player detective horror adventure. And though there are some things to like with the eventual product, there are also quite a lot of things that don't work too well. But the fairly decent pricing of $15, though I paid $12 since I got a small discount if pre-ordered, makes some of the flaws a bit easier to forgive. Let's take a deeper dive and see what this game is all about. In the game, you can choose from a half dozen or so different characters that come straight out of the actual card game, and they are your usual film noir archetypes like the wise old professor studying the occult, the bowler hat wearing musician who spends his nights wasting away playing in the nightclubs, the street rat with a dark backstory but who eventually found peace through religion, etc., etc. The art that is used for these characters are the exact pictures of the actual card game, so the art design there is very beautiful, but of course not that original. So you can choose one of these characters, and as I said, each have different attributes and statistics. One character can maybe heal a few points more, or the other can handle guns a bit better, or then another character is less prone to caving in mentally. These are what I like to call small differences with consequences that feel pretty big. A lot of actions you perform in this game will take a toll on you mentally and drop 1 point of your mental health, and once you reach 0, you get a permanent debuff for the chapter you are currently playing in. A particular character has, for example, 2 or 3 points more mental health than some of the others, meaning they can withstand a lot more damage there, which feels like a big deal even if the point difference is only a handful. So you can choose your character and start the adventure. You get invited to a luxurious mansion by a well-known elderly professor, and once you arrive, you notice that there's no one around, and eventually stumble upon a gruesome murder. You first get control outside of the mansion and need to find a way in. Here it becomes immediately apparent that the budget for this game was not very high. Graphically, the game does not impress. It goes for a cartoony style, which I find wise since it obscures a little bit that the game looks like a PlayStation 3 title. If they would have gone for a more realistic look, it would have been way more apparent how dated the visuals actually were. The cartoony and plasticky style of the characters saves it a bit, and I should also say that the full and warm color palette is pretty nice to look at. But otherwise, the presentation is very lackluster and probably one of the 2 biggest problems with the game. The cutscenes are quite dull since animations don't really show, and instead of proper cutscenes you are kinda looking at stills each time where maybe 1 or 2 things move slightly. Animations during conversations are very basic and minimalistic, and also during the sections where you control your character, the animations look stiff and very aged. What I will say about the game is that it has a lot of voice acting, and the voice acting is not bad. It's also not brilliant, but it does the job, and has a varied voice cast for a game that has more than 10 different characters to meet and play with. The game can be divided in 2 gameplay sections. First is the adventure aspect, where you go around areas and find clues, search for items, and interact with certain things in the environment to progress the story. This indeed feels like an adventure game, like some of them were back in 2004 or 2005. You walk around various locations and can see prompts in the environment that you can interact with. Some will just give a tiny bit of explanation or background story, while others have a more important lore notion on story progression or hints on how to solve a puzzle. Then with other things you can interact with, you can get new weapons, healing items, or other buffs, and there are even some interactions that merely serve to give you a debuff. One thing that is pretty cool here is that this game has a search mechanic where, depending on which character you currently have in your party, can give you a hint on how to search for a reward. You see, you start the game with only the one character you chose, but it won't take long before you stumble upon another character in the mansion, and then you have a party of 2. Then from the next chapter onward, you can often bring 2 characters you have collected with you in the next chapter, and will then meet a third new character that will join you during that story. Each character has a certain search type that they are specialized in. This can for example be physical, logical, or social. And depending on what or who you interact with, the type of interaction, like logical or social, can be different. If you are trying to open a locker or a chest, it's often a physical search. And if you have a character in your party that has this trait, they will give you a hint on how you have to proceed. Often you will get multiple options of how to open the chest, by for example forcing the lock, breaking the lock, or trying lockpicking. But there's only one correct answer. Choosing a wrong answer will increase the chance of something really bad happening during that particular chapter. Now with 2 options to choose from, you can more often than not kinda guess which options to choose from the item description, but you sometimes have 3 or even more options to choose from, and each time you choose wrong, you get closer to something really bad happening. So in that sense, it's very handy to have a varied cast of characters in your party so you can search varied things with them giving you hints. If none of the characters have the correct search trait, then you simply have to guess, and I guessed wrong many a times when this occurred. It can even be a reason to bring along certain characters. During each chapter, your characters can get certain debuffs due to their mental health dropping by seeing or experiencing certain things or facing horrifying enemies during combat. Once their mental health drops, it gets reset again, but they get a unique debuff that sticks with them and can even stack multiple times during that chapter. At the end of each chapter, all your characters return to the office and you can choose a new party that will go on an adventure in the next story. Each character you do not bring with you will have one debuff removed after that chapter is done. At a particular point, I was about to choose my party for the next chapter, and obviously I would have gone with the 2 characters who were the only ones without a debuff. But they shared the same search trait, and therefore I could only search one particular style of item, and this was the reason enough for me to exchange one of those characters for another that still had a debuff, but had 2 other search traits, which proved very useful as I could successfully search so many more items with this particular cast. The adventure aspect is honestly the best aspect of the game, and though it can feel clunky at times, there's definitely some choices to be made and dilemmas that get thrown your way. There's even some optional objectives that can be pretty fun and very rewarding, like finding a note talking about a secret compartment in a piano that will give you a shotgun. Each character has 4 or 5 inventory slots, and these will get full very quickly. Often you will want to have a melee and a ranged weapon with you, and maybe some healing items. That's already more than half of your inventory full. But then there are also certain items that can heal your mental health, like cigarettes, or potions that will cure certain ailments or negative status buffs, or items that will increase your mental or physical defense or healing. There's nowhere near enough inventory space to bring everything with you, and so you will have to choose wisely and even leave stuff behind despite it being useful. Luckily, you can often leave the item at a location and it will not despawn until the end of that chapter, so you can always return to a certain room and grab the item once you have used something else and have gained some space in your inventory. This adventure and exploration together with the story itself are again the best parts of the game. Story-wise, it's a type you have seen before, with a gruesome murder happening at a mansion, and then you visiting locations linked to that person, including a university, a mental hospital, the streets of New Orleans, and eventually also the swamps of the bayou. The puzzles you sometimes get to solve are also pretty cool and go deeper than just finding a key, though you have those too. And these puzzles have you properly read text or remember things that characters said, like searching for a particular book by a specific writer with a unique look, or one involving a globe and constellations and you having to properly explore the environment to find out the answer. Many of the locations are corridor-based and pretty dark, and some do overstay their welcome a bit, but the best chapter by far is the one where you wander along the streets of New Orleans, as it's beautifully vibrant, full of people, and it's the only time the game feels somewhat alive. This chapter also has a greater emphasis on exploration than combat, which is why I love it so much. Because let's then finally talk about the combat, undoubtedly the weakest part of this game. The combat in this game is turn-based, but compared to other turn-based combat games out there, it's kind of the bottom of the barrel, unfortunately. At first glance, it does look like you have a lot of different options. You can attack with various weapons, depending on if melee or ranged ones are equipped. You can move around, use an item, trade with other party members, reload your gun if you have to, or stay on overwatch so you will take a shot at an enemy that moves into your range. Each character has 5 action points, and each action takes a different amount. Firing a pistol will, for example, cost 3 points with some characters, while firing a shotgun will take 4. Standing in overwatch or using an item only costs 2 points, so if you fired a gun, you can still do something else worthwhile afterward. This is all fairly basic, but where the combat in my opinion is a letdown is with how uninteresting it is. How unvaried and how sometimes frequent it is. The game starts okay, with in the first chapter you only having to fight 2 battles or so, and these are against these hooded figures. Nothing too bad, and with only 2 party members they are disposed of quickly enough. Then in the next chapters, the university and the mental hospital, you have significantly more battles to do, and by that time they are already kinda running out of steam. You get introduced to some new enemy types, like a spellcaster or a grotesque looking tentacle monster, but by this time some of the encounters feel like they are purely there to lengthen the game, since the turn-based combat can take quite a while, and can very easily burrow down to you just doing an attack and leave it at that, since you only have 1 action point left afterward, and cannot really do anything else. Boss encounters offer maybe a bit more leadway, and give you chances to use items that will replenish your action points, so you can do not 1, but 2 attacks with a particular character. But the absolute worst is in the next level, which is a giant mansion where you get captured and need to find your other mates while also exploring the mansion itself. During this chapter, the game will often spawn enemies and a fight after you have interacted with certain items, and they did this so often that it became very frustrating. In almost every room, there was some item or buff I could find that would initiate a battle, and for a moment, I was afraid that this would be standard from now on, meaning that the exploration part, the best part of the game so far, would also become tedious because exploring would spawn enemies in all the time. Luckily though, this is not the case, and only there for that particular chapter. Later then, you fight tiny monsters in the swamp that die with 1 shot, but then explode and hurt everything around it. These battles are over quickly since they die with 1 hit, which was a blessing in disguise, but in all honesty, the fighting in this game is just very dull, and you lose interest in it way too soon. Your characters will never level up, so the battles still feel the same at the end of the game like they did at the beginning. Now of course you will get more powerful weapons, but the damage output by the enemies is often around the same the entire way through. Now of course, with the card game or board game, or however you want to call it, combat is also turn-based, and of course also very slow and not spectacular, since it's simply you and your friends imagining and talking and deciding on what actions to perform. But that co-op aspect, or at least the conversation aspect, makes up for that and makes it seem like you are under a lot of stress or something is at stake. But it translates very poorly to this turn-based combat, which is not that interesting, let alone by having it be a single-player combat only. There were also numerous bugs that I encountered during playing, which were pretty annoying. 2 times I had it happen where an item I wanted to search had no description, and I got a weird message giving me no hint whatsoever on what I had to do. I also had it happen that during combat I was not able to perform any action and could just switch between different targets but not do anything else, not even press pause or quit the game or attack. This also makes the game feel a bit more sloppy, unfortunately. Now the game is pretty lengthy, with you probably taking around 7 or so hours to complete it, and for a $15 game, that is definitely worth your buck in terms of playtime. But again, the presentation is very lacking, and the combat is also wearing off its welcome very soon, to the point where the exploration and adventure part is still enjoyable, but definitely defiled by the other lesser parts of the game. Now I could still recommend it to the fans of the lore of H.P. Lovecraft, since the story, locations, and adventure part adhere to that love of this universe, but maybe even then you could wait for a sale and see if the price dips under $10. There have been other $15 games that offered a more polished experience, but this game is neither great nor terrible. It's just a bit basic, with some enjoyable aspects and some frustrating aspects. In the end, Arkham Horror Mother's Embrace gets a 6.7. From what I understand is that the gameplay design is based on the board game video game House of Madness, and though that had randomized areas and multiplayer, this has none of that. I believe the creators already said that they don't plan on adding anything new to this game in the form of DLC, which is a shame because I think a multiplayer patch, even if only local co-op, could already have this game raised about half a point upwards and be a bit more enjoyable.